about you guys, but I don't like changing blades just to change blades. So what I did was I took my blade, now I've set it back to 90 degrees to the table, off of the 12 degrees from earlier. And we're not going to have to change that angle to cut our tenons. We're actually going to bring a tenoning jig over and use the tenoning jig to cut our tenons. In the meantime, with my regular blade still in here, I want to cut the cheeks for the rear apron. So I have the marks that we made over at the table from the actual mortise itself on the rear leg. And what I've done now is I've set up my fence and my sled. My fence and my sled are all square to the blade. That's why I'm able to do this. So with my fence over at 3/4 of an inch minus an eighth for the width of the blade, which is 5/8 of an inch on my scale over here, I'm now going to come and take my piece and run it across in all directions to create the cheeks on all four sides of each side of the tenon. Now I can't just take an even amount on both sides because my tenon location is actually off center. So let's take a look at that real quick. I'm going to come over and you'll see that these are the lines we made coming off of the actual piece itself. I've brought those up to the 3/4 of an inch here. So the outside piece, the tenon is closer to the outside than it is to the inside. So the first thing I'm going to cut is a cheek for the outside. And then I'll turn that around 180 degrees. I'll cut the same over here. And then I'll flip it over and reset and move up to this new mark right here and cut my next cheek for the side for the inside. And after that, I'll come in and cut cheeks for the top and the bottom. The other thing I want to say is when you're doing this, you want to, if you're going to do it like this, make sure everything's square. And this is just my method, and there's lots of different methods of cutting tenons. So I'm going to take this piece, put it against the fence, and run this piece forward. And as I run it forward, I'll come in contact with the blade, come past the blade, pull it out, and then readjust my height until I work just up to those lines. I forgot to mark out the heights for, well, the length of the tenon. So the length of the tenon is 2.5 inches. If this is 3 inches tall, then I need to mark in 1/4 of an inch. So on these next passes, I'm basically looking to make a cut 1/4 of an inch deep on both sides here. What I have now is cheeks on all four of my sides that are nice and square. They look really good. Everything's nice and square. I'm not going to have to come in and fix these cheeks. When we do the dado, I'll remove material outside of the cheeks. So you can take a look. We're good all the way around. And I've come in just a hair deeper right at these lines for my width of my tenon, and then here for the height of my tenon as well. I switched over to my dado set, and I just have 2 blades in there for the 1/4 of an inch. It's been sharpened a couple times, so maybe it's just a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch, but that's the 2 blades for 1/4 of an inch. What I'm going to do right now is start working just one side and a little bit in, and I'm going to work slowly up to the lines that we drew earlier, and then bring this piece over to the actual rear leg and see where the tenon is and how everything works. I have my square set for a fat 1/8 of an inch. And basically what I want to do now is bring my rear apron up and see if I'm there yet. I'm not quite there. What happens if I move over to where I am? Yeah, I think I'm going to take a little bit more material away. And taking a little bit more away will move the apron closer to the outside of the back of the rear leg. I took off just a little bit more material, and let's give it a shot. Yeah, I think I'm there. This is good. So what I'm going to do now is cut the rest of this tenon here, flip this around, cut the same matching bottom piece, and then we'll start work on the top. Well, that went well. I didn't screw up and cut the wrong side or anything like that. Not that I've done that before, but not on this project though. But what we're going to do now is start working on cutting the thickness of the tenon. That's why I brought the rear leg here. So I'm going to flip the piece over and start removing material from the bottom. And I'll just kind of be eyeballing it for thickness here. Once I get basically where I want to be, but a little bit thicker, I'm going to stop right here. I'll cut both sides, finish it off, then head over to the bench. And at the shoulder plane, I'll bring this down the correct thickness. Over here at the bench, and before I grab the bench hook, throw it on, grab the shoulder plane, when I cut my cheeks with the regular blade on my table saw, I didn't go quite deep enough, and that's okay. I'm going to grab this chisel here and just clean that up. But let me show you what I'm talking about real quick. You can see right here that I have a little bit of material left to remove, and I'm just going to use the chisel to pry that out. Go in a little bit. Come down from the top and remove that waste. Normally when you want to reduce the thickness on a tenon, you would take even amount of swipes on both sides. In this instance, we don't want to do that because I set my piece for my tenon entering in on the outside. So I have the outside down. I'm going to move material from the inside because I already set I like my reveal if this tenon goes into the mortise for the rear leg. So I'm going to remove material only from the inside face. Let's see what the fit's like. Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, that's not going anywhere. Perfect. Do the same on the other side, and then we'll cut these guys off and get our tenon fit. I'm just going to cut off 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more, on each side of our tenon, and then we'll head over to the bench, round these guys over, and fit it to our mortise. I have a small problem. I have square ends and round ends in my mortise. So the square ends on my tenon, I'm going to round over with a rasp. I just have a Nicholson 50 rasp. I'll start the rounding there, and then the chisel, I'll move down to the very bottom. And then we'll get this tenon fit into our mortise. Time to try it out. Okay, well, that's perfect. Just hand pressure and stays. They're not going anywhere. It's nice and square all the way around. Perfect. Let's take a look at the reveal. You can see that we still have a nice reveal from the top, and as long as we don't go over that line later on when we pattern out this leg, we'll be really good. So everything looks great. It's time now to move on to the apron and the rails. What's this crazy contraption in front of me? Well, it's a tenoning jig, and we're going to use it to cut the tenons on our rails and our front apron. Now, if you have a multi-router like I do, go ahead. It's a beautiful machine for that. If you don't, and you don't want to spend $3,000, which I completely understand, this is the way to go. I read an article in Fine Woodworking magazine, and it helped me pick the tenoning jig that I bought here, which is this Delta tenoning jig. I like it because I have a micro adjustment here on the left, and it sets up pretty well. So let me talk about the setup. The first thing I did was I took my bevel gauge and I made sure that the fence that the piece goes against is the widest part of the piece was set at 12 degrees. Then with another square, I made sure that the plywood fence that I screwed on was squared to the tabletop. And once everything there was set, I was ready to go. Why is this piece of plywood here? Well, it's another fence, and it helps to support the cut that we're going to do for our tenons with our dado set, and help prevent blowout, and it'll make a much cleaner cut. With this screwed in, next thing I did was I took one of my pieces and I set it into the tenoning jig. And once I had the piece set into the tenoning jig, I brought it up to the table saw blade and I set the distance for my first cut. Now, I can't make both cuts with this jig here, the tenoning jig, at the same time, nor can I cut one and then actually move the tenoning jig over. I have to move the piece over instead. And the reason for that is there's not enough room between the blade and the fence that's on the jig. So I would just be cutting metal to metal. And for my saw stop table saw, that would be horrific. And I think for any table saw, actually, that would be pretty horrific because there's a ton of metal here. So instead, what I did was I milled up another piece. Before I get too far and I forget, I wanted to say that at some point before I shot this video, I had accidentally zeroed out my dial caliper with the jaws actually out. So my readings I was getting was actually incorrect. The thickness of these tenons is more like 0.370 for me, 371. 3/8 of an inch is 0.375 inches. However, my bit's been sharpened a few times, so it's sitting around 0.370, 371 right now. So that's actually the thickness of my tenons and my mortises as well. So I'll correct that with some lower thirds and I'll dub over it. But just so you know, I milled up a spacer and it's 0.60 inches thick. And the spacer here is going to go between the piece I want to cut and my tenoning jig. And that will help me then get moved over. So it's 0.60 for a reason. It's 0.60 inches thick because the blade is 0.250 inches and the tenon is 0.320, let's say, inches thick. So that's why I arrived at my 0.60. I was actually 0.57 and I rounded up, give myself a little bit extra. But I'll probably end up moving the jig over a little bit, making a cut, and then slowly moving back to the proper thickness, but not actually landing on the correct thickness, but getting real close to it and then using hand tools to get my perfect fit. So what's the first thing we need to do? Well, the first thing we need to do is to figure out how we're going to cut these pieces. And that's why we used all these lines where we laid out our tenons. So when we put a piece here, we know that it's supposed to, one, because the angle it's been cut, rest against the table saw the way it is, and two, where it's going to enter into our tenon, or layout for our tenon. Now the rails are a little bit different than the apron. The rails, you take a pass, you make a cut, you pull it back, and you flip the piece end over end, and you make your next cut. With the apron, it's a little bit different. You take your apron piece, you put that in, pass it through, make a cut, and then you flip it 180 degrees around, and then you make your next cut. So just a little bit different, but you got to be aware of that. I mean, I think you'd probably know because you put the piece in and the angle would be wrong against the table, but just in case, I wanted to go over that. So the first thing I want to do is make an initial pass on every single piece. We're not going to try to cut the tenon all at once. We're going to cut one edge of the tenon on all of our pieces and then set up and cut the other edge of the tenon on all of our pieces. So let's get to it. As you can see, I'm just below my line here, and I want to bring the blade up a little bit more until I reach that line, and I cut in 3/4 of an inch deep. Before I make this cut, what you'll notice is I don't pass the blade through and then pull it back. Instead, I pass the blade through and shut the machine off and then pull it back. If I pull it back, we're asking that something may wobble or move, and I don't want to cut more material on the way back. I just want to cut material on the way out. That way I know that every piece is cut the exact same way. Okay, I made one cut on the apron. Now I'm going to unclamp the apron, take it out, and just flip it end for end. I set my apron aside, put my rail in, lock it down, and make the first cut on my rail. I'm going to unclamp the rail and flip it over. And put it back in. And now make my next cut. I'm going to take a pencil and mark the number 1 on all the first cuts I did, this first pass. And the reason I'm doing that, so later when I go over and plane these over, or go over and use a shoulder plane at the bench, that I know which side I want to work on. It's now time to cut the other side of our tenon with your spacer and either your rail or your apron clamped up into the tenoning jig. First, we want to check that we have enough distance between the blade and the edge of the tenon to make a 3/8 of an inch tenon. Bring my square up to the edge of the blade. And it looks like I'm at 3/8 of an inch, just a little bit over. That's perfect. Now that we know we have enough thickness for our tenon, it's time to cut our pieces. So just like before, we want to take one pass on the table saw as we push the tenoning jig past the dado set, and then shut off the table saw. Pull the tenoning jig back and either flip over the piece in the correct direction or put a new piece in and start cutting that. Before I can use the bench hook, take my shoulder plane, and get the tenons to fit, got one more step, and that is to cut them to length, remove some material, and then with a chisel, bring our shoulders in line so we have a nice square shoulder all the way around. So here's how we do that. The first thing we do is we're going to mark in 1/4 of an inch on each side. So I'm just going to come here and real quickly with my square mark in 1/4 of an inch on both the top and the bottom on all of my tenons. Okay, we're here at the bandsaw, and what I need to do now is to freehand cut close to my cheeks here. So I had the fence set at about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit over. And when the blade starts running, what I'm going to do is take my piece and angle it up roughly 12 degrees, eyeing the shoulder here and the lines I made, and cut into the piece and stopping just before I get to my cheek. And I'll pull out, turn it around, and do the same thing in this direction as well. If you wanted to make a wedge to help support the cut, go for it. There's obviously downforce from the blade, but we're not trying to sculpt or move, so I'm not too worried about that. So I'm just going to take my Dozuki saw and not even try to get too close to the line, but get kind of close to the line and just remove this waste, and then we'll chisel it back in a minute. Here's where all the time on setup comes into play. So if we take our bevel gauge set at 12 degrees and we bring it in and line it up so it's flush on both faces of our tenon, and come in with a marking knife, establish a line that we're going to pare down to. And I'm just going to grab a chisel and start paring down. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Let me get a little bit closer though. We're going to grab our bevel gauge and line it up so it's flush on both sides. Grab our marking knife and mark a new line. So now we're just marking the shoulder with our marking knife on a Mortise material we need to get rid of. And I'll just come in and pare down. Now you may want to pare into the wall a little bit just to relieve a little material, just to make sure that you're not bulging out. You may be worrying about these little guys right here, all this fluffy stuff or whatever you want to fibers, and don't worry about it. With a plane, a couple passes on a plane, this will disappear right away. Over the bench with my shoulder plane and bench hook, I take a few passes on the tenon, see how the fit is, and if I like the fit in my mortise, then it's time to head over to the vise with my rasp. I'll round over the edges on all four sides. With the edges rounded over on the top, it's now time to pare down to the base of the tenon and remove the rest of the waste. And with that, it's time for our final fit. And let's see if the piece will fit into the mortise. So I've been working a little bit, and I've got both of these fitting into their mortises. This is the front apron, and this is the upper side rail. And it fits into the mortise, both the front leg and the rear leg. But as you can see, they can't both fit into the mortise at the same time. So what we need to do is create a little bit of a chamfer or an angle on the inside so both of these can occupy the same space. Let me show you how I do that. So you can see the tenon coming through this mortise, that there's going to be a collision between the two of them. They can't occupy the same space. So what I do is I grab a marking knife and I go in and mark the edge there. And I take the piece out. And with that out, to help you guys, I'll take a pin and I'll mark in where I knifed. And I'll do the same for the other piece as well. So with the opposite, or the piece from the other mortise, I'm going to come in with a marking knife and do the same thing. Take it out. And draw a line to help you guys see where this is. So now I'll take a block plane and just start working this back, chamfering it at 45 degrees. With that chamfer made on both sides, now I'll take the piece with the chamfers and put it back together. So now once you chamfer those two edges, you can get a nice tight joint on both sides. Okay, and there you have it. We have one side of the chair together. You may have to remove some material for the rear apron as well. It just depends on where you put your mortises. And I know on my chair that I definitely had a little bit of issue with the rear apron and the upper side rails coming into each other, or or being in the same space for the mortises. And I'll show you that footage. Before I can put the rear apron into my chair and then get everything dry fit, we need to do just a couple more things. Number one, we need to round these tenons over, but before we do that, we actually need to remove a little bit of material from the tenon. There's two ways we can do this. We can either pull out the rails and do the same thing we did before, which is at the bench with the block plane, cut 45-degree angles on both sides so the pieces don't touch each other. The other thing we can do is if we take a closer look at this mortise, in order to find out how much material I need to remove from the tenon on the rear rails, I'm going to take a square, insert it into the mortise, push the fences square against the leg, and then from there I can take a measurement. This measurement tells me that there is between 10 and 11/16, so I'm halfway between 10 and 11/16. So that means that the distance from the edge of our piece, where the tenon begins, until where the fence here begins, is all wood, just before the tenon protrudes out from the upper rails. So I'm going to take my square, put it up against the wall, to the end of the ruler against the wall of the cheek, and now just take my marker and strike a line. Back here at the table saw, I have my rear apron. Here's the outside, and then here's the inside, and here are the lines that we drew. So with these lines drawn, I know now where I need to cut with my blade to remove material as far as this plane is concerned. What I'm going to do is just kind of eyeball the center here, and I'm going to lift the blade up so I'm just taking half of the material away. Because when I looked in the mortise itself, I could tell that the rails were not protruding any deeper than what the half of the mortise was. Just a little bit shy of that. So I'm going to just remove as much material as I need. Okay, I rounded over the tenons at the bench just like we did before, nothing different. And now for the moment of truth. So I got one side here of my chair, and let's see what happens. I haven't tried this yet, so here we go. Oh yeah, we're there. Perfect fit. This is great. I'm going to try the other side, but I'm pretty sure we're right there. The next thing we need to do is build some clamping cauls. So to make these cauls, we're going to need some material. So the first thing I grabbed was this piece of walnut. It's 1/4, nice and thick. It's got a knot over here, so I'm probably not going to use it in another project, but just grab something. It doesn't matter if it's walnut or alder or whatever it is. Just grab some scrap material that's thick and relatively wide. This maybe is 2 3/4 of an inch wide, and we need that width so that we can, one, make a piece that'll fit around the leg, and two, so it's got enough bulk at where it connects that when we apply all this pressure, it won't snap on us. What we want to do now is lay out one of these clamping blocks. So the first thing I'm going to do is put my front leg on top of the clamping block. And I've left myself a good amount of wood on the right hand side. So what I'm going to do now is just take my marker. I've now marked out where my leg location is. With the leg location marked out, the first thing I'm going to do is just put some squiggly lines in there, telling myself I got to cut that out. Now with that marked, I'm going to take my bevel gauge set at 12 degrees and continue these lines up until the end of the piece. Now that I continue my lines up to the end of the piece, I have an understanding of my angles. So for instance, when we clamp across the width of the front legs, we want to clamp in this direction. When we clamp across the width of the side rails, we want to clamp in this direction. So we'll draw those arrows in. Right, so those are the two directions our clamping pressure is going to go. In order for our clamping pressure to go in this direction, we need to now create a new face that is in the same angle as that direction. So in order to do that, we need to come in here and put our bevel gauge upside down, the opposite direction, and strike another line. So here, we're going to remove all this material here, and we might as well just do this too. And now when we put our clamp on it, it's in the correct direction as our parts, and the clamping pressure is in the correct direction as well. So the next thing I'm going to do is just take my square and strike a line here, and that allows me to start laying out my next leg and then my next clamping caul. We're over here at the bandsaw, and we're just going to now make our cuts to pull out all of our different clamping cauls. All right, we're back at the table, and it's time to clamp up our chair for the first time. Over the table saw, we just cut these clamping blocks for ourselves. And what we're going to need to do is attach them to our front legs, both here on the upper rails and another one on the lower rail. So in order to do that, I grabbed some blue tape. You gotta love this stuff. And just get it taped up like that. So I'm gonna go tape up the other ones in the front. Now it's time to clamp this up. The first thing we need to do is, once we put the chair rough together, is make sure we have everything at the right heights. So I got a straight edge here, and it's got 36 inches on it, and we just need the first 17. So what we need to do is come in here, take the ruler, place it against the upper rail, or the front apron that is here, and just make sure that it's at 17 inches. So the very top of it needs to be exactly at 17 inches. Okay, let's clamp this together. Just making sure that I'm on my cauls. And you can see that even though I put my rail in, and there's a little bit of play in my joints, so I've got enough room to move them up and down a little bit. I am just below 17 inches right now. So I'm going to take my dead blow hammer and just lift the rail up ever so slightly until I reach that 17 inches. The lower rails are supposed to be 5 inches from the bottom. So I took my little square here and I just set it at 5 inches, and I'm just going to go around and make sure that the very top is no more than 5 inches from the rail, and it actually should be 5 inches all the way around. So this one's just a little bit too high. Perfect. A little bit too high. I'm pretty happy right now. The chair's looking great. All of my joinery is really nice and tight. We got some great grain direction and pattern. We got our clamps in. Everything's rock solid. The chair's not moving at all. And to me, it's a success.